So, welcome to my physical artifact, which is actually data, if you see that as physical, my little data stream podcast. But today I'm going to be talking about homelessness, the causes of homelessness, some of the issues, and the misinterpretations of homelessness. There is this strange conception or misconception, I would rather say, when it comes to homelessness, that it's this one and done deal that someone becomes homeless. And I don't think enough people really understand the breadth of homelessness, even just in America. Here I have the End Homelessness um, Association, the National Alliance to End Homelessness. I have their website right up here, and it's just looking at some of the demographics of homelessness. Overall, a little chart here talking about the number of people experiencing homelessness from 2007 to 2020. I have 2020 pulled up here. Overall, 580,466 people are experiencing homelessness. 409,000 of them individuals, which I'm going to get to. 171,575 people and families. 110 of them chronically homeless individuals, people who are in and out of shelters and homes. They can't get out of it. 37,000 of those being veterans, and only 34,000 of them being unaccompanied youth. Again, why those go down, I will kind of discuss. Homelessness is a crazy issue. It's maybe not as much seen where you and I live in the Midwest, but it is seen in greater areas of population. For example, the cities with the most dense homelessness populations are New York and California, where we see a lot of people. I would say, just looking here, I believe the most dense Midwestern state with the amount of homelessness is Minnesota, with about 7,900 people experiencing homelessness, which is 14.1 people per 10,000. The density, the amount of people is greater in Michigan, but the density is lower, with 8,638 people in Michigan who are homeless. But beside the point, people do not understand the epidemic that is homelessness. With over 500,000 people who are homeless recorded in just the United States alone, it's not necessarily known as much as it should be. There's a large variety of issues that kind of take part in what makes someone homeless, and a lot of people generally chalk it up to something like personal incompetence and money responsibility, but there's a lot of like social, economic, personal conditions that can start the lead down into homelessness. To understand homelessness, I think it's good to understand these demographics a little bit. So, from what I again have pulled up here, the biggest part of people who are homeless have no support system. That's why the majority of them, over 400,000 of them, are just known as individuals. They don't necessarily have a family to rely on, a shelter to rely on, where it gets lower for people who are in families. The chronically homeless individuals usually have a support system to get them in and out, but there's usually struggles that kind of cause this in and out issue. And then veterans and unaccompanied youth. Youth generally have at least a foster home. Most youth have some sort of support system, luckily, to keep them off of the streets, and that's why it's so low. And it's the same thing with veterans. They have a little bit more of a support system than you see your average individual having. But being a veteran, there's a lot of issues that I will maybe get down to a little bit later of what causes homelessness. For a veteran in particular, they never had the time to build up experience on a resume. So they could be older and they're less hireable. They can never get a job and they could have issues with PTSD. And it starts to become this culmination of issues that they then cannot get a job and find a home. And they end up homeless. The sheltered homeless population in particular is actually declining because we lack funding, and that's because it's such an overlooked cause that it doesn't get the funding that it necessarily deserves. A lot of these homeless shelters run off of just barely any government funding. They run off of a lot of donations, and they don't get the donations that they need. It's expensive to keep someone off of the streets, and people are not kept off of the streets. It's really expensive, and they can't necessarily afford to do so. They can't find the workers to do so. So you can only have so many people in a shelter. In a quote here I have from Sarnowska in an article that they wrote about understanding homelessness and the environmental factors that cause it, said, defining the cause of homelessness is problematic because public opinion on the cause of homelessness is unambiguous. He becomes homeless because such a choice is made, quote unquote. It's a spectacular approach grounded in stereotypes and lack of knowledge about the scale of the phenomenon. So the definition of homelessness is so clouded, and many factors really contribute to an individual story. I think a lot of people suffer from main character syndrome, that the only real story they know is about themselves. And it's important to understand that homelessness is not just, oh, someone's homeless. It's there is a whole story behind this one person becoming homeless. One example that I found was Poland in the 1980s, which is like so far away, but it's something that needs to be understood that this still causes issues for people now, today. In the 1980s, there's this huge liquidation of state farms, which tore people away from their homes because their homes were workers' hostels, because that's what they could afford. They could afford to live in workers' hostels, and they got money from working on these farms, but it led thousands of people to fall to homelessness. And families still suffer from this today because it's a huge economic issue. So you can't necessarily blame some of the people in Poland who are homeless now because their families were screwed over 40 years ago. You know, a lot of things are out of people's control that bring them to homelessness. You know, to understand homelessness, there's a lot of misconceptions around it. It doesn't seem to be understood by people who qualify themselves as a realist, because in real standards, you just have to work hard. But it again gets overlooked that working hard can only go so far when you don't have a home to go and take a shower and have clean clothes to go to your job every day. People don't have that luxury. And you can't get a home to put down in your application. They won't even take you. You know, there's so much more that goes into getting into homelessness and getting out of homelessness that is just misunderstood. When someone becomes homeless, it's a ton of factors that cause this and lead to it. It's more than just one thing. People usually chalk it up to just someone not being a good societal norm person. So it is common for the main cause to be the biggest issue, to be a triggering factor that we know. So something like this could be mental illness, such as PTSD, depression, schizophrenia, which really slowly destabilizes one's competence and ability to perform in the world around them. But it could be things like financial and social struggles that cause these episodes. So it's one thing that leads to another. So the veterans, for example, could have something like PTSD or depression from their time overseas in the military that really, really hinders how they can perform as a normal person in society. And it just brings them down this domino effect to homelessness. So, one thing people chalk up as a reason for homelessness is substance abuse, which, again, very fair for people to see this. The times where this does happen is generally when it's mixed with other issues that cause the initial uses of substances that, when they go without support, going back to what I said about a support system, end up causing homelessness. Your chances 100% heighten when you start to abuse any sort of substance, but that's not just the only reason. That's the thing to understand. There's multiple reasons. Another thing is like social factors. Your social status and standing can be a great determinant of your risk of being or of being homeless and falling into homelessness. You know, if you're an individual who's just born into a financially struggling family, a poor financial situation, you could very quickly succumb to a life of homelessness, especially as you grow up, because you weren't given the resources you needed to really go be an adult. So you very quickly fall to homelessness because you can't afford the world around you. There's such a convoluted selection of factors that can lead to homelessness that people just don't understand it. There's a huge mix. If you have an unstable home life at 5 years old, tons of things start to add up. And by the time you're 18, you're out on the streets. 13 years can be the road to homelessness. It's not an overnight thing. The other big thing that we, as a whole, that's psychologists, social workers don't know, is the moment of switching to homelessness. The only thing we do know, like I mentioned, support systems, that is a really important theme here, is that people who fall to homelessness generally fall to homelessness because they find themselves feeling as if they have a community there. People think that homelessness is just your one-off folks, but there's a lot more than that. There's a lot more than that. The homelessness falls into places of greater population, so there's generally a lot more, and it's a lot more dense. There's a lot more people because they kind of end up coming to a conglomerate in at least little areas, little parks, alleys, parking garages. They find homes within each other. The one thing we don't know is when that mental switch happens. It's important to note that generally people who find themselves on the streets for more than a week start to fall victim to accepting their situation. But we don't know. A lot of people who become homeless generally can't recall the point in which they accepted homelessness. And that's why it's such a big issue to understand it before it can happen, understanding the signs, understanding what can lead to it, what can be triggering factors, because if we can stop it before, we could maybe keep some folks off of the streets and give them the support they need while it's easier, rather than later when it's not. The final words I'd say I have is understand the large amount of causes and factors that lead to homelessness. What causes it can't be confined to one singular reason or causation. Anything that I've said here is just the tip of the iceberg. It's just the start of what homelessness can be. And that should be recognized. If you have a chance to speak to someone who's homeless, get it right from the source. And you'll realize there's so much more to it than what people who have a home see. Everything I've said is just the start. Look into it more yourself is the only thing I can really say, because it is so important and it's something to understand and recognize and maybe even appreciate where you're at and what you could do for people out there. This has been my little podcast data physical artifact. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening, and peace out.